welcome to MidPoint. I'm Sean Kinane. I'm the host of MidPoint Monday. We've got a range of topics on today's show. We'll hear the FBI director confirming that there's an investigation into possible Russian meddling in the U.S. election. James Comey also confirmed today that neither the FBI nor the Justice Department has any proof of wiretapping claims by Trump. We'll also have guests on to talk about science under attack by the Trump administration. Plus, we'll hear about wiki equality, an art and feminism Wikipedia edit-a-thon, and we'll take your calls. Here's the number to call if you'd like to get in the queue right now. 813-239-9663. You can email your question or comment to dj@wmnf.org. You can text us at 813-433-0885. We'll hear from FBI Director Comey in just a few minutes, but right now I want to talk about our first topic. Our first guests today are part of a panel discussion this afternoon at USF. It's called Science Under Attack. Dr. Parmvir Bahia is a research associate at USF Health, and she's director of Scientists, Inc., that's a science outreach nonprofit. And Erin Sauer is a PhD candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology at USF. Welcome to WMNF's MidPoint, Parmvir and Erin.
Thanks for having us, Sean. Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start first with this. Is science under attack by the Trump administration?
I think personally for me, science has been under attack for a long time, but that might be partly because people don't understand what scientists actually do. But it does feel like efforts have been concentrated more recently, and certainly for somebody working under an NIH grant, the proposed budget cuts recently are really, they would be very impactful to us.
An NIH grant, that's National Institutes of Health.
Exactly.
So tell us what you do and what kinds of things you would get grants for.
Well, I work in the lab for a scientist called Thomas Taylor Clark, and our group is researching the role of the nervous system within diseases that would normally be considered to be immunological. That's namely things like asthma and COPD. And a large part of that NIH grant that comes to our lab would be covering the funding for both the students, the scientists themselves, plus any consumables and things like that that we use, and it would make it certainly far more difficult for us to do our work.
And let me ask you, Erin, what kind of research do you do and how might science funding affect that?
Well, I am in Jason Rohr's lab in the Department of Integrative Biology at USF. And we do lots of disease ecology and toxicology work. So personally, I look at how thermal biology of the host can impact disease susceptibility. And I've received grants from Army Corps engineers to do behavioral thermal regulation stuff with, or how animals might alter their behavioral thermal regulation in response to disease exposure. And that Army Corps of Engineer grants are actually one group that's been proposed some budget cuts under this Trump budget. Our lab also receives grants from the EPA, the USDA, and NSF. EPA funds a lot of pesticide research, and we do some work with how pesticides can influence disease ecology, particularly with schistosomiasis, which is a worm that infects humans usually in the third world. And pesticides can have some interesting interactions with the snail intermediate host and boost pathogen exposure in human populations.
So both of you, Erin and Parmvir, you're both part of this panel discussion this afternoon at USF. It's called Science Under Attack, and it's at 4 o'clock in the building called MSC, room number 3705, the Manatee Room, and it's in association with the Graduate Research Symposium. Why are you having this symposium, or this panel discussion rather? Why are you having it, and who will be there? Who will be the people presenting besides you?
So I'm actually leading the discussion. I'll be moderating this afternoon. And largely this is the work of Suzanne Young, who really has been championing the role of USF and how our science is portrayed and protected. As for the panel themselves, I think Erin, as one of the panel members, would probably know better.
On the panel, I'll be representing the graduate students. We have Jody Harwood, I believe, as a faculty representative. Gerard, the university's general counsel.
Yeah, and there's also, I have the list here, there's also an Associate Dean for Research, Randy Larson, and Paul Sandberg, who's Vice President for Research of Innovation and Economic Development. So you have scientists and students on this panel, but you also have a representative from the USF administration, the top level of the school, the University General Counsel. I assume this would be someone who might answer directly to President Genshaft.
Yep.
Why is it important for you to have someone from the USF administration on this panel?
I think for me personally, part of the problem is that we don't understand what the university can and can't do with regards to standing up for us, and what happens under certain circumstances if a particular scientist is highlighted as somebody whose work is going to be adversely affected in a given way. So for me, it would be interesting just to know how the university can respond, not whether they will.
And speaking of responding and the university responding, and earlier you mentioned Suzanne Young a few months ago, I guess it was. I interviewed her. Our listeners might be familiar with this story where the students and the faculty and the researchers at USF, once Donald Trump was elected, they said to USF, they wrote a letter saying, you wrote a letter saying, we are concerned what might happen at USF under the Trump administration to scientists and to researchers and to federal funding and so forth. And initially, there was no response at all from the university administration, is what we reported. But since then, the USF administration has told me that they have responded. What's been the response so far to that letter?
So the response was sort of well, of course we support science, but let's wait and see what's actually going to happen with this administration. We specifically wanted them to address concerns about climate change funding and climate change research being supported at the university, and they sort of didn't mention that at all, and they just sort of took this wait and see approach. And we've waited, and we've seen what the administration's targets are, and it's slashing science at every possible space where they can, particularly climate science.
So what's your response to the USF's response? How do you feel about that response?
I think it didn't go as far as it needed to go. I don't see why they needed to take a wait and see approach when it was apparent from the cabinet positions that Trump appointed and the things that Trump has said in the past, that this wasn't going to be a science-friendly administration. So for them to sort of say, well, we don't know, it might actually not be that bad, they could have just made a statement like, of course we support climate change and we agree that climate change is caused by human activity or whatever. Because there's tons of climate change research going on at USF, and it seems kind of silly that they would fund all this research and support all this research and then not stand behind the research that they're producing.
For example, the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt recently said that carbon dioxide is not the human created carbon dioxide is not the main driver of climate change. That's what the EPA Administrator said, and a lot of the grants that go to the university from the federal government are from the EPA. So it seems like and a lot of them are looking at carbon dioxide and how it affects climate, and then on down the line how that climate change affects the biology and the chemistry and so forth. So it seems like wait and see what we've seen is what you're telling us, and that there are statements that there will be changes in how science is funded and how science is viewed from the Trump administration, and yet your university is kind of still taking a cautious approach, I guess.
Yeah, so part of the hope of this panel is to now address, since we've waited and seen, we can ask the university again, what are you going to do to support the science that you're already doing, and support the research that you're already producing in regards to climate change or pesticide influences, or I think there's a number of NIH cuts happening too. So there's tons and tons of places where funding's being cut, and I think federal grants and contracts are the second largest revenue source for the university, and federal federally sponsored research makes up, I think, about 20% of the university's revenue. So this is a huge chunk of the incoming money to the university that they depend on to fund their professors, fund their graduate students, run their research, keep the lights on, as they like to say. And they should be supporting that research if they expect to continue to bring in that revenue and continue to exist as a educational institution or a Research One university.
Our guests are Erin Sauer, a PhD candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology at USF. We also have Parmvir Bahia, a research associate at USF Health. And you were talking about getting grant money, how much grant money is a part of the university, how much it relies on it essentially. And people might think, okay, well, you get grant money from a federal agency like the EPA, and all that money goes into test tubes and beakers and things like that. But there's also something called overhead. Explain overhead and how that might tie into this idea of the university wanting to make sure that science funding from federal agencies continues.
So essentially what the overhead is a kind of, it's us paying rent as scientists to the university for the ability to have the space and the resources in order to be able to carry out our research. And as you say, that forms a significant proportion of the money that comes in from the grant. So if we don't have the grant money, then they don't have the overhead, and that's a huge decrease in the amount of money they'll receive.
So let's say you design an experiment to look at something about asthma, and you think that to do this experiment it will cost you $400,000. Well, you have to write ballparking the numbers here, but you have to write a $500,000 grant from NIH, and they have to give you, the cost of your research plus this percentage overhead that goes straight to the coffers of USF.
Exactly.
To
Yes.
pay for things like secretaries and copy machines
Yes,
and things like that.
indeed.
All right, if you'd like to join the conversation, here's the number to call, 813-239-9663. You can email us at dj@wmnf.org. Text us at 813-433-0885. We have Glenn on the air in St. Pete. Hi, Glenn. You want to talk about pesticides?
EPA itself. I worry about things like the atrazine and the weed and feed and our amphibians and the endocrine disruption. And I just, I've been wanting to take the time and even some sort of petition, but now who to get the ball rolling and that kind of thing. It's been, atrazine was banned in Europe, and here we are still using it for money because we're denying science, just like our administration is.
All right, Glenn, thanks for the call. So would either of you like to address the idea that, that if the less funding for science, the less we know about toxins in the environment? All right, thank you, Glenn. Great, thanks for the call.
So without the EPA, the large burden of protecting our water bodies and protecting our environment falls upon the environmental protection agencies at the state level. And while that might be great if you live in California or some other state where your state level EPA is run well and actually regulates, if you live in Florida or some other state where the state level EPA is even less funded than it is in Florida, there's huge risks for pesticides being put into the water or being not regulated, so there's even more of them running off into the water. I mean, we have problems with red tide all the time here, and that's not pesticides so much as it's fertilizer, but that's another thing that is regulated by the EPA. The amount of fertilizer you put in the water is regulated by the EPA, or the amount that you put on your farmland is regulated by the EPA. Same with pesticides. And without the federal EPA to answer to, if you're just answering at the state level, the repercussions are lessened. The burden, the actual labor burden of getting people out into the field to regulate is put entirely on the state. It makes it more expensive for the state, and things are going to fall through the cracks, and we're going to see increases in water bodies being polluted, or increases in red tide, which can cause or can agitate people with asthma and things like that here. It's a huge problem in Florida. Yeah.
You know, if it's easy to, I mean, it might be easy for someone to figure how it would affect science if the EPA funding is cut or NIH funding is cut from the federal level, and then that trickles down to fewer grants or smaller grants or something. That might be easy to figure out. But what has the Trump administration's travel ban, how does that affect science?
I think the primary concern would be for us, the very nature of science is a collaborative endeavor. You have to meet other scientists in order for your results to be discussed and for you to be able to come up with a consensus on a given subject. And so international meetings are hugely important to this. Obviously this will affect not just people leaving the country, but anyone trying to come into the country, because the vast majority of huge meetings, for example neuroscience, they're all held in the US. And from a very easy standpoint, it's quite easy to see how that would affect how science proceeds if scientists can't effectively communicate with each other.
Has there been any rumblings under the radar here where international scientists, because of the travel ban, are deciding that they might boycott conferences in the United States?
Certainly, I've been following on Twitter a number of them who've said that for the foreseeable future they will not be attending conferences in the US, and that hampers us in the same way.
Yeah, it sounds like it would affect American scientists most of all if that happens negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And then at USF, there's the case of an Iranian student, Mehdi Zegami, who has, because of the travel ban, was unable to get the visa that he was promised right away, and so for a while he was stuck in Iran, and he's trying to get a second visa, and we're going to see how that works out. We'll continue to follow that story. But that's another case where you have a scientist who happens to be from another country, who's been studying at a university, and now is, at least temporarily, not able to come and study at that university. So that would affect his colleagues, that would affect people who might benefit from his research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can certainly see the ripple effect from a single person not being able to come and do the work that they've been hired to do, essentially.
Well, our guests on the show today have been Dr. Parmvir Bahia. She's a research associate at USF Health and director of Scientists, Inc., that's a science outreach nonprofit, and Erin Sauer, a PhD candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology at USF. Their event today is Science Under Attack. It starts at 4 o'clock. It's a panel discussion that's at the MSC 3705 room at USF Tampa campus. That's also called the Manatee Room, and it's in association with the Graduate Research Symposium. Thanks so much for joining us on WMNF's MidPoint today, Parmvir and Erin.
Thanks for having us, Sean.
Thanks. Well, we'll be back in just a minute. We're going to have a music break right now, and in a bit we'll talk about wiki equality. But first, we're going to hear about James Comey, the hearings today. Stay tuned. Right after this music break, we'll hear from James Comey.